Hello, my name is Richard Ashdown, and I'm a tutor on the Jack Greek Summer School. This video is about active, middle, and passive voice in Greek. You can see from these three examples that Greek has three forms of the verb for the first person singular aorist indicative. These different forms are different voices of the verb: active, middle, and passive. You can also see that they correspond to different meanings. Although in this example the forms and meanings are different and predictable, things are not always so straightforward. In this video then, we will first look at what voice is, starting with some English examples, and we will then review the forms and meanings associated with active, middle, and passive verbs in Greek. So what is voice? Well, this is a surprisingly tricky question. One way to think about it is that it relates to how the verb and the grammar are fitted to the participants in the action or event that a speaker chooses to mention. A verb is used to refer to an event or an action, and the choice of verb will usually determine what participants must or can be included with it. For instance, English has some verbs which only allow for one participant, such as sleep. Some may have two, such as catch, and others may have three or more, such as give. It's also possible to have verbs which have zero participants. For instance, in English, verbs like it rains. The verb also usually determines the grammatical form of the words for those participants. They may have a particular case ending or word order. So contrast the cat catches the mouse with the mouse catches the cat, or we hear her and she hears us. Or they may require a particular preposition, as in the farmer gives some grain to the chickens. To the chickens has a particular form. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to the participant that the verb agrees with as the subject of that verb, whether it is doing some action or having some action done to it, or neither. In English, the subject typically comes before the verb, as for instance, the baby in the baby sleeps, or the farmer in the farmer gives some grain to his chickens. Some words in English have a distinctive form when they're used as a subject. For instance, he, she, I, we, they. Verbs that have two or more participants usually have at least one of the participants that is not the subject as a direct object. Direct objects in English typically immediately follow the verb. Some words in English have distinctive forms when they're used as objects. For instance, him, her, me, us, them. Note that some verbs in English are phrases that include prepositions. For instance, listen to, look at, watch out for, and the object will come immediately after them. Many verbs in English can have a range of patterns of participants without changing the form of the verb, simply by deleting one, as in the cat eats the mouse becoming the cat eats, or an iceberg sinks the ship becoming the ship sinks, or by adding one, the baker walks the dog, or the poet writes a poem, the poet writes me a poem. In these cases, sometimes the verb's meaning changes subtly, for instance from walk to cause to walk, or from cause to go below the water to just go below the water, but sometimes it doesn't, as in the eats example. Another way in which English verbs can appear with a different number of participants in different roles is by becoming passive. This reduces the number of participants mentioned by one, namely the subject of the equivalent active verb. The subject of the active verb is absent in the passive, so the cat has been deleted, and the object of the active verb, the mice, is now the subject of the verb, and it has changed its form. The verb has a passive form, and it agrees with that new subject. Here's a further example. The corresponding passive form for my friend gave a present to you will lack the active verb form's subject, my friend, and the active verb form's object will be the subject of the passive verb, and the verb will change its form. We saw a moment ago that verbs in English can have different arrangements of participants without changing their forms. So alongside my friend gave a present to you, we can also have my friend gave you a present, and this sentence can be made passive in English in the same way. We get you were given a present. Now, so far in all the examples, we have seen that the passive reduces the number of participants mentioned by removing the one that is the subject of the active equivalent. To be more precise though, that participant can still be mentioned. but it's optional and in a different place in the sentence, using the preposition by, as here in by the cat and by my friend. So, to summarize so far, verbs may be combined with different numbers of participants as their subject or object, and they may have different meanings when they do so. Sometimes these differences correspond to differences in the form of the verb, and sometimes not. The difference between active and passive voice is one in which the form of the verb is different, and the number and roles of participants are different. Let's now turn to Greek, where we can make some very similar observations. We'll talk first about the different forms that verbs may take in Greek. Greek has three voices, active, middle, and passive, and in principle, every combination of person, tense, and mood can appear in any of the three voices. However, the forms are not always different from each other, and indeed not all verbs have all three forms available. Here are the first person singular indicative forms of a regular Greek verb. The active form is identifiable as active in all tenses, but in the present and imperfect, the middle and passive forms are identical. The same is also true for the perfect and the pluperfect. You may want to pause at this point and review the forms for the other persons and moods of the verb, and also the infinitives and participles. If we now turn to meaning, the relationship between active and passive in Greek is very like that of English. For a verb such as pauo, the participant that is the subject of the active sentence, hopais, the child in this example, is omitted in the corresponding passive sentence, and the participant that is the object of the active sentence, tous nautas, the sailors, is the subject of the passive sentence. The cases used and the verb endings change accordingly. The subject appears in the nominative in both sentences, while the verb has its distinctive active or passive ending and agrees with that subject. So epause, third person singular active agreeing with hopais, and epausesan, third person plural passive agreeing with hoinautai. Note that in Greek only objects of verbs that appear in the accusative case can engage in this process. Now let's think about the third voice, the middle. The meaning of the middle is much less predictable. It often, for instance, conveys the idea that the subject of the verb is involved in the action in a different or additional way as contrasted with the active equivalent. With pauo, active, meaning cause to stop, the middle may often mean cease or come to a stop. In this example, the relationship is quite like the English that we saw earlier. The iceberg sinks the ship and the ship sinks, or the baker walks the dog and the baker walks. But in English, we didn't change the form of the verb to reflect the different meanings for those verbs. Greek, on the other hand, does change the voice for this verb. We saw earlier that the passive only makes the subject of the active verb become optional rather than impossible. In English, we expressed it using the preposition by. In Greek, it is regularly expressed using the preposition hypo, which is then followed by the genitive case. If a passive verb is in the perfect or pluperfect tense, by is regularly expressed not by hypo and the genitive, but by the dative case on its own, although hypo and the genitive can be used with these tenses too, especially if the dative would be ambiguous. Let's now look at another verb in its different voices. This verb is luwo, I wash or I bathe. In the active, it takes a direct object, the person or thing which is being washed or bathed. Here, I wash the baby. We might think of this as I cause to become wet and clean. In the middle, the meaning lacks the causation, or perhaps involves the subject in the action in an additional way. So luo mai, I wash myself, or I become wet and clean. Note that the middle verb can still have a direct object, as here in luo mai tosoma, I wash the body for myself. In other words, the middle expresses the idea that the subject, I, is further involved in the action, in this case as the possessor of the body. In the passive, the object of the active verb, the baby, topaidion, in I wash the baby, corresponds to the subject of the passive verb, topaidion luetai. The baby is washed. Before we look at some more examples of middle meanings, you may like to do some practice on the relationship of passive and active. Here we have a passive sentence. The dog is pursued by the young man. Although diokotai could be either middle or passive, the hypo phrase makes it clear that this must be a passive verb. Pause the video and have a go at turning this passive sentence into its active equivalent. The hypo phrase tells us who the subject of the active sentence ought to be, so we can put the young man into the nominative case ton merakion, and for convenience we'll put him first, although Greek word order is flexible. The verb needs to change to the corresponding active form and to agree with the subject. So here, present active, and third person singular because the subject is ton merakion. Finally, the subject of the passive verb will correspond to the direct object of the equivalent active verb. So we need to put ho kuon into the accusative case, ton kuna. Of course, as I said, Greek word order is flexible, and so this sentence could equally have had these three elements in any order. For instance, ton kuna, dioke, ton merakion would be equally correct. Here is another sentence for you to try. The girls are deceived by the philosopher. Again, you may wish to pause here. The active equivalent here is ho philosophos exapata tas choras. By the same process as before, the hypo phrase gives us the participant who will be the subject and put into the nominative. The verb changes its form to be active and agrees with the subject. And the passive subject gives us the active object, which then goes into the accusative case. Ho philosophos exapata tas choras. We can also practice the opposite transformation. So here we have the dog chases the horses. Pause the video and try to turn this into a corresponding passive sentence. First, we will remove the active subject. Second, we make the active object into the subject of our passive verb and put it into the nominative case. Tous hippus becomes hoi hippoi. And then we make the verb into a passive form and we make it agree with that new subject. So dioke becomes diokontai. If we wish, we can make a by or hypo phrase from the active subject. So here we now have the horses are pursued by the dog. And again, word order can be flexible in Greek, so we could have put diokontai first, or even hypotoukunos. Here is a final sentence for you to try. The girls are saving the fleeing man. Again, you may wish to pause here. Following the same process, we can create a passive sentence by dealing with each part in turn. The girls, as the subject of the active sentence, become an optional hypo plus genitive phrase. The verb becomes passive and agrees with the new subject, which is ho fugon in the nominative, which we obtained from noting the object of the active sentence, ton fugonta. Let's now return to the middle and look at some other verbs with other relationships between the active and the middle. Here we have the verb luo, to release. The situation here is that the prisoners have been released, as we can see from the passive verb, hoi desmotai eleuthesan, the prisoners have been released. The corresponding active verb is used of the person who did or caused the releasing. Here, the king. Ho basilius, the king, eleuse tous desmotas, the king released the prisoners. When used in the middle, this verb can have the meaning obtain the release of, typically by paying a ransom. The middle thus has an object in the same role as the active verb, but the subject is involved in the action in a different, perhaps a less causative way. Here we can start from the middle. These are examples of the verb peito. In the middle, peitomai means pay heed to or obey, and takes an object in the dative case. Here, the population obeys the orators. The corresponding active verb is more causative in meaning. I persuade, I cause to obey, and it takes its object in the accusative case. Here, the orators persuade the population. The passive relates to the active in the usual way. The population is persuaded by the orators. Hodemos perthetai hypoton rhetoron. We can see then that there may be a relationship of meaning not only between active and passive, but also between active and middle, but that the active and middle relationship is rather more idiomatic and depends on the meaning of the particular verb. Very often, these meanings and their relationships simply have to be learned. Here, for instance, we have lambano, which in the active might mean apprehend and take the accusative, but in the middle can mean take hold of and takes the genitive. Thus, I caught him doing wrong, and I grasped hold of the altar. Touton adikunta elabon versus elabomen tubomu. In the passive, the meaning relates to that of the active in the normal way. Hokleptes elefthe. The thief was caught. Since it is sometimes hard to see how the meanings for active and middle forms of a verb are related to each other, it is not surprising that we find some verbs which do not have both forms and are simply middle in all their forms, or are middle in some and passive in others, but have no active forms. Thus, macamai, fight, punthanamai, perceive, dunamai, I am able, gignamai, I become. The reason for their forms lies in the history of the language and can be obscure to us. For these, and indeed for regular verbs which do have active forms too, it is usually the case that we should learn the meanings and the types of participant involved when a verb appears in each voice form. There is often no distinction of meaning between active and middle. Many irregular verbs have some tenses that simply use the middle form without having a different meaning. This is very common in the future tense, but it can happen in other tenses too. So the future tense of akuo, lambano, pasco, horao, amy are all middle without any change of meaning. Erkamai, on the other hand, is middle in its present form, but has active forms for its future amy and its aorist aelthon. Erotao, eroteso, erotesa are all regular and have active forms, but there is also the irregular aromain as an aorist form. So, in summary, voice refers to the relationship between the form of a verb and the number, the nature, and the grammatical form of the participants in the action or event it describes. Greek verbs may appear in active or middle or passive voice forms. Not all Greek verbs actually have all three voices available in all tenses, and only aorist and future tenses have distinctive forms for all three voices. If a verb has an active form in a tense, the corresponding middle form often has a meaning that involves the subject in the action or event in a way that is different and sometimes additional. The subject of a passive verb would usually be the object of the same verb describing the action or event in the active form. Very many common verbs are irregular in how they behave in respect of voice. That is, the relationship of meaning to forms is somewhat unpredictable and usually has to be learned. For more resources on ancient Greek, please visit our website www.greeksummerschool.org.